So thank you very much for inviting me. What I was really keen to do this morning was just talk to you about facts and evidence. Having been in the diversity space for many years, I have a small confession to make, is that I grew increasingly frustrated by coming to diversity conferences and hearing the same sorts of things time and time again, being recycled, and not feeling I could take that away and do something positive with it. So in my 10 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is just share some of the findings that I have learned from running 100-odd national equality standard engagements, but also our pay assurance and diversity business. What these grapes are supposed to do is just show you the breadth of engagements that we've been working across. So look, this is a heat map, and don't worry if you can't see what's in here. What we did at EY, we pumped in the data from over 100 engagements that we had across the national equality standard, and simply wanted to look at how British business were achieving against the competences that we assess them against. So if I dig down, what you can see very clearly, and I'll explain why this is important in a second, is if you look across UK business, for all the ones we've audited, CSR and strategic relationships sit right at the very top. So that's the thing that businesses do really well, and that's hardly transformational. That's the sort of stuff that's been going on since the 80s. Regulations and policies, you still see that a lot, and still see businesses are making sure they comply with their legal obligations, and employee support and adjustment ditto. And what's less visible always is supplier diversity, with one qualification, which I'll get to in a second, and ditto with return on investment. So where this becomes really interesting is here. So we've worked with about 20 businesses in construction, property and real estate. And they're the likes of M&G, Grosvenor, Land Securities, British Land and so on. And when we pumped in their data to the information that we had, the results were entirely different. And so if there's anything that we've learnt, is that we cannot have a broad brush approach to diversity anymore. And to Simon's opening points, there really needs to have a degree of specificity in the way that we consider this subject. So supplier diversity was a really key strength in construction and property. And if you think about the contract, for example, in HS2, right at the core of them is requiring businesses in that industry to make sure that they have complied in the appropriate way. Ditto with talent identification, i.e. there's a war for talent in that industry, and having a really strong sense of industry insight. On the converse, I won't go through all of these. Measurement is still a real big problem in construction. If you look at professional services, again, a slightly different picture. Really strong performance on supplier integration, and really keen visibility on return on investment. And why is that important? For those of you who work in professional services like I do, or in legal firms, you'll know that the bottom line is critical. You'll know that margin, utilisation, and all that good stuff is what drives profitability. So they're not going to invest in diversity initiatives unless they know what return they're getting on it. Converse that with the original results I just flashed up there, you'll see a very different output. And there are areas where performance is still to be questioned. And I'm going to come back to inclusivity in a moment. So what are our top key pieces of learning? I'll just pick out some of these. So if there's one consistent thing that we've learned across all of our engagements, it's that black and minority ethnic performance is still the lowest insofar as the way that they're assessed as individuals within workplaces. And whatever's been going on, to pick up on Simon's points earlier, this is clearly not working. I asked the team to go in and just speak to companies and say, ask the black and minority ethnic people what they thought was going on, and then ask their managers. And one of the many things that came back, and this is evidenced in the race disparity audit as well, is they were saying that we don't really feel we get the feedback that we really want. We don't really understand what we're not doing right. And managers often reported that they didn't want to give honest, open feedback. Remember, this was all in confidence because they were fearful of being accused of being racist. And this conflict, we need to get over it because it's causing a huge problem in the way that these people are being assessed. Still a huge lack on return on investment. So you'll see these diversity initiatives go on right across British business. And then when you ask what return it's given, very few businesses are able to articulate the value that it's creating other than in professional services. Inclusivity. So if it's one thing I hear all the time, it's, well, we're moving away from equality, we're moving away from diversity. It's all about inclusivity for us. It's all about bringing your full self to work. It's all about making sure that we value the different people we can bring. And unfortunately, unless you've got your infrastructure in place, unless you know where there are blockages in your talent life cycle, that's an impossible mission to achieve. And we see it. We see businesses who've stepped right over here without thinking of all the basics, the hygiene factors being in place. I'll pick out a couple of others. Somebody in the 80s said interview panels, you should have a woman on an interview panel and you're more likely to recruit a woman. Or if you have a black person on an interview panel, you're more likely to recruit a black person. So we had a look. We really assessed the data. And I can tell you, categorically, there is no correlation between those two things at all. I don't know who decided that was a good idea, and I know the intention behind it was good. So what we do absolutely know is if you have a diverse panel, you're more likely to recruit a diverse candidate. But the people sitting on those interview panels, people like me, have been subject to the same biases that everybody else has. So my decision about somebody who rocks up an interview and talks like I do and talks quickly like I do, I'm probably going to have the same biases as anybody else would. I'll move on. No, in fact, I'll just use one more. Training and more training. You'll still see this real broad brush approach to businesses having lots of diversity training. There is no evidence, as Simon alluded to at the beginning, that that's going to drive the difference unless you target it in a very specific way. We also come across myths, and a lot of them all the time. And these are my 4 most common. So when the team report back, how did it go when we were delivering X or Y engagement, they say we hear these 4 things all the time. First one, and these are all evidence-based, and these slides are publicly available, is if you have a woman on an interview panel, you're more likely to recruit a woman, who's been interviewed. So this is research that was done with the Harvard Business Review in 2016. If you just have one woman who you're interviewing, the increased likelihood of recruiting a woman is 0. There's a 0% increased likelihood against the benchmark. And that's because the light is shone brightly on that woman for her differences, and you're less likely, or you're not likely anymore to recruit a woman. If you have 2, you can see the likelihood increases, and 3, you've got a really large chance. But this concept of just having one person to tick some box to increase your proportionality of women is not founded in any evidence. Second one I always hear is we just want the best person for the job. We've got to have the best person for the job. And I don't think women would want to be recruited because she's a woman, and I don't think a black person want to be recruited because they're a black person. So we normally have a tennis match at this point, which goes something like, bias is a human condition, so it's unlikely that you're going to recruit on merit. And they'll come back and saying, actually, even though everybody looks exactly the same, X is from one country and Y is from another, so we have diversity of thought. And then we'll go back and we'll say, yes, but visible difference is very important. And actually, you know what? We've stopped. We've stopped doing it because for them, this is really valid. For them, this is really important because they want to drive profitability and growth, and they simply don't believe it. So what we try to do is provide some very simple, practical guidance and steps in order to help them. And one of them that's worked enormously well, and a lot of you probably aware of this, is some companies now have blind CVs, have stopped looking at universities, have stopped looking at university grades, but also they've thought far more out of the box than they have before. And we've said, just try and think of a slither of your new recruits, so just 5%, just open it out in the recognition that the people you've got who you've used and hired using traditional methods also haven't all been successful. And the results for us have been startling, and privately I'm more than happy to share with you. Unfortunately, I can feel Simon speeding me up as I go through, so I will more than happy to share in the plenary if time allows. The other one I always hear is women go off to have families. We did a lot of research with City and also with a professional networking group. What did we learn? For the 4 out of the top 5 reasons that women leave jobs are exactly the same as the reasons men leave jobs. Only the 5th reason was to spend more time with families. And with a professional networking group that we're part of, actually 70% of those women went on to do jobs in other professional services firms. Final 3 or 4 slides. This is really important to me. So everybody's talking about having more diverse teams. I think it's really important. And you'll probably hear today that people say it'll make you more productive. Actually, it doesn't unless you do the following things. So we analyse loads and loads of data. You absolutely will be more productive if you have a diverse leader who understands how to manage diverse teams. If you don't, you'll be at a steady state. But productivity drops off hugely if you don't have somebody who knows how to make the best of the people you have in your teams. And this is all fact-based. This isn't me just saying this because it sounds good. This is all based in fact. It's really important that you recognise that. And there's a way to make sure that your leaders manage diverse teams well. There's also a big link with culture. So having now worked in the market a lot and doing cultural assessments, you can't look at diversity in the round without looking at the way that an organisational culture operates. And by that, I'm sorry, these words are really small, are looking at things like silo mentality, bureaucracy, hierarchy, information gathering. And there are some really negative behaviours that are pervasive within organisations that will have an impact on the way that you perform with diversity and inclusiveness. What we did in this dummy company is we separated the results between men and women and analysed how culture impacted on D&I. And I'll pick out just a couple. So if you look at the results for what women reported, overwhelmingly, they saw as negative behaviours, silo mentality, feeling excluded, and not feeling included within the organisation. And you can also see from the top, this is what we call a cultural stress barometer, that the response rate from women was far less than it was from men. And there are certain really interesting facts that come out if you start to dig the data down even more. So this is a real life example, and I'll just urge you to look at the top in the men category. When we asked them to feedback on what they saw as positive behaviours in the organisation, you can see right at the top, they thought diversity of thought was a really positive attribute. And you can see right through the age characteristics, whatever age you're at, they all thought that. But no women felt that. Also on employee recognition, which is linked to pay, you can see that in every category, men were able to articulate that pay was a really positive attribute in the organisation. And no women were able to articulate that. So this is based on a real life study. So you could see, obviously, thinking about gender pay gap, how there are differences in perception based on what probably happens in organisations. Right, I'm going to skip that. Final bit I want to talk about is gender pay assurance, and we've got Dr. Zanu in the audience you'll hear from later, who we partner with in the market and do some great work. We've just, we're working extensively doing assurance on businesses, and we've just completed the BBC, actually, which of course, for all the reasons you all probably know about, was hugely interesting for us to doing the assurance. These are just some headlines I wanted to report back. There's only 233 from the 11,000 that are in scope who've actually reported back at the moment. There are huge challenges around gathering the data and some real misinterpretations actually around some of the complex rules that underpin all this. For example, how do I treat overseas workers and how do I treat bonus payments? And when we've gone in, we've recognised that. And these are really well-intentioned companies who are still struggling to gather some of the data and complexities around that. But notwithstanding, there are some of them who've come out and started reporting, and some of those are being well publicised. But for those who have, you'll know the reasons for doing so are indeed varied. And yeah, about 30 seconds.
I'm not asking.
Yeah. So, and here are some organisations who've done it really, really well. And you'll see those who have assessed methodology and understand the source data have performed massively well. So, final thing is this is the future. You'll all be thinking of robotics and AI. So what do our clients tell us? Gosh, this is a minefield for them. And there'll be some big, you may have heard of reported cases of algorithms literally designing their own pathway and having one big case in the States that an algorithm was found to be racist. So finally, please don't presume anything. The landscape is changing. We cannot have one broad brush for diversity anymore. As I showed you earlier, there's specificity in sectors. culture is critical. And I will say, as my very final comment, that the one thing that I've always found offensive in the world of diversity is when I've heard this statement of white, pale, male, stale. I think it's massively outdated, actually slightly racist. And from the times I've spent overseeing 100-odd engagements, it's some of those white, male, stale men that have been some of the most inspirational men. So I'd say whoever invented that has a lot to answer for. I think it's incredibly outdated and we should stop using it. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Arun.